All right, I definitely want to honor your time. I know that it's Good Friday and a lot of people are on vacation. So for those of you who decided to show up and join us this afternoon, I'm so excited. It is 2:01 Central, and so we have a whole lot to do and a lot to cover and a lot to discuss today. So I definitely want to make sure we get to that. I'll leave the poll up for just a moment while I introduce myself. But welcome. I'm seeing a lot of people who are joining. I'm seeing the list of attendees grow as we get into the 2 o'clock central hour. And so I'm also looking at some of your responses to the poll questions because I'm always curious as to why people show up for Bold X Brave. We've been doing Bold X Brave since last year. And I think our first one was in June of last year. And we've done, this is number 6 or 7, I think if we count one that we did for a conference, this is 7, but 6 or 7. And so we have some people who come every single time and they're really immersed in this work. They're still trying to figure it out. So we want to make sure that the content is fresh and relevant. And as we really move into, moving beyond awareness, right now is the time for action. And so that's the reason why we're here. So as you are continuing to answer the questions, I'm going to quickly introduce myself. For those of you who I don't know or who I've never had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Janae Johnson. I'm the owner of CTM Unlimited. You'll see some others on my team who are also going to be in chat, specifically Exo Claveria, who is our executive admin, and he's also managing the chat today. So if you have questions, if you have technical difficulties, this session is extremely interactive. So if you came just to watch me, then you are going to be disappointed. Today really is about your engagement and making sure that you get real actions and tools that you can take back with you to your company. So thank you and welcome, welcome. I see I have like a count over here on my other screens. I can see the attendee list growing by the moment. So thank you, welcome, welcome. And if we have time, we'll come back to this poll question, but we're gonna go ahead and move on. I'll tell you a bit like throughout this session about our company and some of the work that we do. And we'll have the opportunity to share some case studies from some of our clients as well. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time getting into CTM Unlimited as a company, but we are a workplace equity consultancy. And so our focus is on how do we create equitable workplaces and truly how do we create a movement around that, one leader, one company at a time. So I think I've already said welcome like a lot of times. And listen, I don't know this lady at all. I don't know her, but she captures how I feel today. Just knowing that there are people who are taking time out on a Friday afternoon, on Good Friday, when they can be anywhere doing anything. A lot of people are off of work and are still joining. So I'm really excited to see all of you and excited that you're here. So welcome. And I needed to share that joy that I'm feeling for you being here. And also I want to go ahead and get into how we do Bold X Brave. So for those of you who are brand new to Bold X Brave, this is an approach that we use both externally when we do public webinars and public classes, but also what we use with our clients as well when we're facilitating internally. So we always start with Bold X Brave agreements. We always, always, always start with agreements. And so the agreements that are up on the screen, these are just in general, but listen, if you do this on your own or you facilitate these conversations within your company, your agreements might look a little bit different. So I'm going to go over these quickly, and then I'm going to ask you to actually do something. So first, we're going to tell the truth, even if it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. And that's one of the things that we commit to in Bold X Brave is that we are going to talk about what is actually the truth. Secondly, we're going to make sure that we engage in productive dialogue. So there are going to be times that you will have an opportunity, if you so choose, to come on camera. You'll have an opportunity, if you so choose, to actually engage with other people. You'll be able to use the chat. You'll be able to use the Q&A. And I'll talk about that in just a moment in terms of how you engage. But we're going to have productive dialogue. Also, we ask that you make no public attributions without someone's permission. So if someone says anything in this session that you're like, wow, that was amazing, or oh, wow, that was heartbreaking, just make sure you get their permission before you go quoting them on LinkedIn, even if you know them, right? And or anywhere else. So we want to make sure this is a safe space. Obviously, this is a public session. And so everyone knows that coming in, but we want to keep this space safe for everyone. So if there's something that you want to quote someone on, just reach out to them directly and ask them for their permission. We're going to honor anyone who is bold and brave enough to speak, even if we don't agree with them. So again, you'll have an opportunity to come on camera or on audio and actually make a comment or ask a question, or engage in some other way. And so we commit to respect no matter what the perspective is. There are going to be some questions that are uncomfortable, but again, we're committing to respect those uncomfortable questions. And finally, we commit to finding one action, whether it's a big one or a small one. So one big or one small action that all of us can take by the end of this session and take back to work with you on Monday. That is always the goal. So I want you to humor me for just a moment. If you agree, because these are our agreements, can you just put it in chat? I agree. Like, I understand it's not legally binding. And for those of you who come to Bold X Brave, you know I always ask you to do this, but this is a way for us to make sure that we're all on the same page, and then everybody else can see that everyone else agreed. So there's no confusion. I see someone said, I wholeheartedly agree. I love that. Like, I'm in, I'm ready. Okay, I see everyone saying, I agree, I agree. I love it. So and for those of you who have not said it, that's okay. I believe you're great. I know we have some people who are actually joining by phone too, or listening in on audio. So maybe you can't respond in chat, but we want to just make sure that we have some agreements before we get started. All right, so let's talk about how you can engage in Bold X Brave and how we do Bold X Brave. So Bold X Brave, you have 3 ways to engage. And I'm actually going to start with the third one first. The third one is just to use the chat, participate in the polls. Everyone can do that, with the exception of those who are maybe just joining by phone and listening in on audio. But otherwise, everyone can do that. You can also enter questions in the Q&A. So in the Q&A module, not only can you enter questions, but you can answer other people's questions. You can upvote questions, and we will take pauses here and there. And I have a good friend of mine that I asked to just kind of help me manage the Q&A. And so when we have a break, we'll talk about what's in the Q&A and answer those questions. But feel free, if you see questions that are relevant or that questions that you want to chime in on. I truly believe in crowdsourcing solutions. And so let's do that. Let's collaborate on what those answers are. And then the first one, and this is the last one I'm going to mention, you can be a guest panelist. Yes, you. Yes, all of you who are in this session have the opportunity to be a guest panelist. And what that means is that you can raise your hand, and the raise your hand button is at the bottom of your screen. And when it's time for us to open it up for our guest panelists, EXO will actually transition you to be a panelist. So for those of you who have been to Bold X Brave before, you know that this is our thing. This is what we do. And sometimes we have like 15 people who want to be panelists. Sometimes we have 6. I mean, it varies. So even when my team is preparing for these sessions, and the question is always, well, Janae, well, how long is this going to take? And I'm like, I don't know. It depends on how many people want to talk and what questions they have. So we have some flexibility built in, but I'll tell you, we have a lot today. So I'm going to move on from the Bold X Brave engagement part. And I want to look at what we have done and what we're reflecting on looking back to 2020. So as I mentioned, in 2020, we did a total of 6 Bold X Brave sessions, and those are just the public ones. We also did some that were private, that were for specific companies, but publicly, this is how many we did. And we started last summer with just opening up dialogue, but these are some of the topics that we talked about. Some of it was, the first probably 2 or 3 was just about raising awareness, just about people figuring out, you know, what these definitions meant. And you'd be surprised that a lot of times we assume that everyone understands what racism is, that everyone understands what systemic racism is. Everyone understands bias and microaggressions, but they don't. And that's something that I had taken for granted. And so it was helpful to listen to other people, be brave enough to say, you know what, I don't understand what that means, but I know I want to be a part of the solution. So you can see some of the other topics, and some of these we will touch on again during this session. But remember, today is about action. Today is about how do we take action on some of these things that we talked about in our awareness phase last year. And now what can we actually do about it? So here's how we're going to dig in. We are digging in on a few things today. And like I said, when I was looking at the agenda this morning, I was like, oh, I don't know if we're going to actually get to all of this. I'm not really sure, but let's see what happens. So we're going to dig into executive sponsorship, and the reason why I'm starting there is because of so much of the action and actually a lot of the barriers that I've seen across multiple companies, across multiple industries. It actually starts and ends with executive sponsorship. So these are questions that I always ask when we're talking to new clients about, what's going on in their organization and what some of the barriers are. I always ask about, well, who's sponsoring this? And, like, what's their story? And do you feel fully supported? The same thing we're going to talk about in a little bit. We're going to talk about ERGs and some of their challenges. But a lot of times those challenges are about how strong or how absent the executive sponsorship is for those employee resource groups. We're also going to talk about data. Now, we have become a little data obsessed, so you have to forgive me. I'm hyped about this portion. Okay, so we are going to share some real ways that we collect data as a company, but also that we help other companies collect data around diversity, equity, inclusion, and more importantly, why data is so important, not just to understand what the problems are, but also to drive transparency and accountability. We're also going to look at that ERG leader struggle. And I'll be honest with you, we might not have time for that portion. We're going to do our best to get to that portion, but I really want to acknowledge that there are a lot of you who are leading out in these employee resource groups or a DEI committee or something similar, and you're having some challenges in your organization. So again, we're about taking action. We're going to talk about how you can actually take action. And then we're going to talk about increasing belonging. So belonging feels like this very squishy thing. And for those of you who were with us in December when we did Bold X Spray, we actually had someone come on and talk about what their company had been doing to really foster belonging among the organization. But we're going to share with you why it's important. And also here are some creative ways that you can actually do that. And then this last part, what is equity? I am super excited because I actually have a guest coming to talk about that. And he wrote a book all about equity and is actually one of my Howard University alums. So I'm hyped about that. And so I'm really, really, really excited and glad to have him. And we are going to move on and dig into our topics today. So I have the agenda organized this way. The reason why is because then I can kind of jump around and we can figure out where we're going to start. So let's start here with executive sponsorship. And it's time for you all to actually answer another poll question. So this is just one word or one phrase. If you've already joined the poll, you can still text in your response or go to your browser and enter your response. But what's the one word or phrase that describes your DEI executive sponsorship right now? Intentional. I like it. Okay. I saw someone in chat say engaged. Unsure. Someone said pregnant. Okay. Solid. Unsure. Someone in the chat said building. Okay. Someone else said wants to help, but not sure how. Committed. A bit hesitant. Okay. I like it. We're going to keep it open for a few more seconds as somebody said lacking. We're going to get into that part in just a moment. Kind of, I don't know if it's kind of committed, kind of unsure, kind of solid. So interesting how that's popping out. So the way that this technology works is going to pull out the word that is most frequently used, distracted. Yeah, that's common. So for those of you who are seeing these responses on the screen, I want you to kind of look at how some of these are going to feel familiar to you, even if it wasn't your response. So what I love about using this tool is that you can see what other people are dealing with, and it's still completely anonymous. Like, you're not going to see your name on the screen. So I want you to feel free to participate in these polls, because it really, you never know who else is in this session who's saying like, wow, you know what? Our executive sponsor is distracted too, or our executive sponsor is slow to adopt too. Someone said non-existent. Okay, so we're gonna get into that, and I'm gonna go ahead and move on. I love I love seeing the responses from the people in the session, but I want to make sure that we move on and look at what are some of those characteristics of a good sponsor and why it's so important. And I'll also explain why I decided to start here. So that good sponsor is someone who is going to be vocal and visible. And they're going to endorse DEI activity. So what that means is that if you are having an event, if you are having any kind of event that's internal, if you have an external outreach program, if you are collaborating with other employee resource groups, if you have, if HR is now looking at recruiting from underrepresented groups, whatever the initiative is, and I'm just naming some that are common, that executive sponsor is that person that is putting their name and reputation on the line and using their influence not only to endorse whatever that activity is, and that just means that they're saying, not only do I support this, but I expect you to support it too. And they also are the one who will make that call to remove barriers. So for those of you who are in this work or who are really interested in helping your company move towards a place of equity, you know that there are barriers, right? Like, we understand that. And so that executive sponsor a lot of times can make that call and say to, your communications committee, hey, listen, we need to send out a mass email, and I need you to work with my team to make sure that that happens. That is what that executive sponsor can do. And so the reason why I start here is going to be very evident when we talk about all these other pieces. But I thought it was really important because a lot of times there are people who are well-intended, there are leaders who are well-intended, but without that executive sponsor, they don't necessarily have a fighting chance, if that makes sense. And so I just want to pause here for just a moment, just to let that soak in. And I want you to remember what we're talking about as it relates to executive sponsorship, because you're going to see how it plays out as we go through the rest of these different topics. All right, so now we get to jump in. Oh, and someone says, let's see, Fred, I'm looking at chat as well. Fred says, executive sponsors should be willing to step forward and take a risk. Absolutely. So, Fred, that's a really good point, because executive sponsors are not just performative allies. And if you missed our session on allies, that was last year, we might bring it back around. But it was talking about what it really means to be in allyship. So your executive sponsor is someone who is also taking the risk alongside of you. So if you are leading the effort, whether you are the VP of HR, or you are in the business, or you are an employee resource group, or you are a task force or committee that's been formed to really move the company forward, that executive sponsor is lockstep with you. They're not kind of in the background and not committed and not visible, but they are the ones that are going to actually take a risk and say, I'm willing to put my reputation on the line for this because I believe in it. Love it. All right, let's go to the data dilemma. I think that's where I want to land now. So when we talk about DEI data, I was having a conversation about 2 weeks ago with a senior leader at this company, and he was just like, Janae, are you serious? Like, I mean, can you really, what is this data thing with DEI? I hear you talking about it. Is this real? Like, he was skeptical, and he was admittedly skeptical about it. And also said, like, I mean, yeah, we could do some surveys and things like that, but I mean, that we already do an employee survey once a year. So how would this be different? And how do we really, drive decision making in the organization and KPIs around DEI? Like, that's a thing. We can actually do that. Yes, it's a thing. And yes, you can actually do that. But first, let's talk about what data does and why it's so important in this space. So number one, it provides executive sponsors with that internal business case. So a lot of times you will have a committed sponsor, but they also need to be able to influence their peers. So whether they're on an executive leadership team or they're somewhere else in the organization, they still want to be able to say, not just, hey, this is the right thing to do, but let me tell you why from a business case standpoint. So data does enable that. Then there's accountability for commitments. So this is a huge one. So when you look at what all these companies last year, whether they committed to what they were going to do internally for their employees or externally for the community, or what they were going to do for small minority owned businesses. There are all these commitments, right? But who's tracking it? Like, and sometimes it's being tracked and sometimes it's not. So, if I had more time, like I literally would probably just sit down and look at all the commitments, because there were a lot of public statements from multiple companies. All the, Fortune 50 companies came out with these very bold statements about what they were going to do. And I'm curious as to where they are, but that's where data comes in. Some of them also make commitments to their employees internally, but this is where we need to see, okay, well, where are you with that? And that's where the transparency and the visibility comes in, for other leaders, but particularly for the workforce as well. So if the workforce understands, like, hey, they're actually making progress on this. The other thing is that when you have a strong way of collecting, analyzing, and visualizing data to drive that transparency and visibility, that data will outlast leadership changes. So we've all been there where we had this amazing leader who was really just pushing for whatever the effort was. Maybe it wasn't related to equity and inclusion, but they were pushing forward, right? And then they left. They got another job, they switched to another organization, and the initiative fell through. So when you have a way to visualize, then there's it outlasts whether or not that person is going to be there. So I want to show you um, a few things, because the question I always get is like, all right, Janae, we got it. We're sold on the data. We get why data is important, but how do you actually do that? So interesting, what's really interesting is that you all, maybe without knowing it, you're already a part of our data study. Let me show you. So when you registered for this session, we asked you two questions. And here's a breakdown of what the results were from those questions. So I want you to think about how many employee engagements that you're doing, especially when in this era where so many of the companies have remote workforce. So they're using Teams, they're using Zoom, they're using WebEx, they're using something. And what stops you from having them to register and sign up? Maybe they already have to sign up for an event that's happening internally. What if you just asked one question? What if you asked two? What if you did a series and asked two questions each time? So we've been doing this since the very beginning, since last year. So we have reports of what people are asking for across industries, across companies. So what that helps us do as a consultancy is it helps us to really hone in on what people need instead of us just coming up with solutions. It's about, hey, this is what people are talking about. But I want you to think about how you could do this at your company, because this wasn't super difficult. We didn't have to do this whole, infrastructure build, and there's no data feed coming from somewhere else. We simply asked two questions, and these are the results. So now we kind of know. We pulled these numbers a few days ago. So of course, when people register late, it's going to skew the numbers a bit. But I wanted to show you this as an example, because this is what we do internally, but also you can do this. And I'm going to share an example with you of a company that did something similar, and really get clear about what's happening with your workforce. So think about the two questions that you could ask your workforce that would actually inform this and give you something to show back to your leadership to say, hey, this is where the pain is. Hey, this is what people are looking for. The other thing is we got a list of all the specific topics and challenges. So this came from you all. So everyone who registered, this is what you all said. Like, we didn't come up with this. This is what you said. So essentially, we asked two questions. You completed your registration. You're showing up for a webinar. And yes, there's no, like, this is, there's not a trick here. But it is about thinking about what are the creative ways, or what I like to call the stealth ways of being able to collect data. And there are ways that you can do this inside of your company. There are ways that you can do this with the tools that you already have. I'm not recommending that you go out and do something different or get something different, but think about all the ways that you're engaging and how are you missing opportunities to ask questions to really get that intelligence that you need to inform your leadership on what needs to happen for your workforce. So I want to share an example with you now that you've gathered the data. I want to share an example with you from one of our clients. And this is actually a dashboard, and this recording is on loop. So you'll see like some things moving around. So we built this in Power BI, And in this dashboard, at the bottom, there are questions from a baseline survey from this particular team. At the top, this is actually a gauge, and there are actual targets. So basically, one of the things that this team wanted to do as a part of the actions that they were going to take around diversity, equity, inclusion was to create this buddy system, which was an amazing idea, but it came from them sort of crowdsourcing their different ideas. And so they decided, hey, we want to pair people on the team so that no one feels like they're on the fringes, that everyone has a point of contact, and that we can really start building authentic relationships. They understood that this was not going to completely fix their inclusion issue, but it was an idea, and they wanted to be able to measure it. Not just, hey, we're going to do this buddy system, but how many people are we going to get enrolled and what's our target? So what you're looking at the top is the number of people, that number that kind of keeps changing over here on the right. So this is the target number of people. What's happening on the bottom is that we built this model so that they could see how people were responding to these questions. And the question is about feeling like they belong. And then how do the responses to those questions correspond with the people who had actually enrolled in the buddy system? So for example, if you see that there are women who disagree about feeling a sense of belonging on the team, and then you click on that metric, it actually tells you how many of them have actually enrolled in the buddy system. So mind you, this is not a complete solution, right? And I'm just showing you one tab. This was a multi-tab dashboard that we built for them. But what this does is it gives the leadership, in this case, it was a DEI committee, it gives them something to investigate. Hey, why are people not enrolling in the buddy system? Hey, what's going on? Like, what do we need to do to intervene? How do we make this a better process? How do we really hit our goal? Because it's not just about the numbers, right? It is about the people. But this helps you to figure out what is going on with the people. So I'll switch from this because I understand that that gets a little busy. This is another screenshot of another version of this dashboard, but this was about setting an actual KPI around their survey engagement. So in their first survey, they had a total of 146 people on the team, and they had 51 people who responded to the survey. This team, and we came back and told them, like, hey guys, we think this is a little bit ambitious. And we blocked out the name of the team because, you know, they're still going through their process of collecting data and deciding on what actions they're going to take. And we're still engaged with them. So for that reason, we wanted to make sure that it was still relatively anonymous. But they set a target. So what they said is that we're going to take the total amount of our workforce, so 146 people, and we want 90% engagement on the survey. Down at the bottom, there's a question that's related to that survey engagement that's in their current survey. And basically that question says, you know, if I observe someone being mistreated, I feel comfortable reporting. I feel comfortable saying that something is going wrong with one of my team members or within my team. And so again, this is just a still image, but you can see where you're looking at how people answered. This is divided up by country just because they span different countries, but it could be divided up by region, by department, by job grade. I mean, there are all these different opportunities. And so I want to just be clear that this is probably like a phase 2, but your phase 1 could literally just be, let's figure out how do we create a survey to really get clear about what people need. And let's not be afraid to ask those questions around how people feel included, if they've directly, experienced any kind of discrimination, anything like that. But this is what this data piece is about. And this is just one example. So hopefully, it's my hope that we've planted a seed. I think what's really important here, though, and just as a preview, if you are one of the bold, brave people who are ready to talk, ask a question, offer a comment, your time is coming. So if you have raised your hand, and I think we might have a few hands raised, I don't know, I can't see that panel. So if you have not yet raised your hand, please raise your hand so that we can move you over to panelists, because that is coming soon. But I want to first look here and talk about how this team got there. So you saw the dashboard, you saw kind of the end product, if you will. But one of the things that this team did that was really impactful and also unique is that they crowdsourced their solution. So even the creation of a DEI committee came from an action planning session where basically everyone provided Like, you know, there are different ideas. Hey, we could do this. Hey, we could do that. Hey, we need inclusive leadership training. Hey, we just need general awareness training and awareness sessions. Hey, we need to do some community partnerships. So there were all these different ideas that people provided. And then they were able to upvote. So we did this live in a session with this team. And so some of their key outcomes included making sure that there was a way to measure and make it sustainable, and then also the formation of a DEI committee. And so instead of, you know, these consultants coming in and telling you what you need to do, this team with really strong leadership and sponsorship, let me just say that, they were able to create their own plan and then find ways to measure it. And so, one of the things that I want to encourage you all to do is find ways to bring people along for the journey, no matter what it is that you're doing. Keep engaged with them, ask them for what they need. Like, say, hey, what is it that you think we can do about this problem? Or what is the biggest problem? And most importantly, create a space of psychological safety so that they feel comfortable actually answering the questions, and provide opportunities for them to answer anonymously. So even with these polls, there are some of the things that people answered that you maybe they wouldn't say it out loud, right? But they're able to say it now. So I want to go ahead and move. I see lots in chats. And so we can move Stacy over to be a panelist because I'd like her to tell me what's going on with the Q&A. But I do see if there's any, I don't know if there's anyone who has raised their hand to be a panelist, but you know, I have no problems calling on people that I know too. Okay, so Stacy, any questions or anything that you've seen in Q&A that we need to address as we pause for a moment? And I think you're still on mute.
Okay, I seem to have lost the, um, nope, there's nothing in Q&A.
Okay, I see some, is this conversation that I'm looking at in chat, or is this like questions? Because I want to make sure that we're like, I'm pausing to answer the questions before we move on to the next thing.
So there was a bit of a back and forth. There was a comment in chat, and then there was a response to the comment, and it looks like it was answered, but
Okay, very good.
yeah.
All right, thank you, appreciate it. All righty, so if we don't have anyone else, and Stacey, I don't want to take away anything from you because I know you've been one of our guest panelists as well. So if there's anything that you wanted to add before we move on, we've got plenty to do. And we also have our special guest that's coming up soon. You good? Okay. All right. So let's get into the ERG struggle. Let's go here. And we're going to start really with asking a question like we have been. So you have another poll question here. And this is where I want you to kind of vote. And it's really just A, B, C, or D. So either you don't have any active ERGs, you don't have any active employee resource groups. So this question doesn't really apply to you, or your groups are sponsored, fully supported, funded, you know, highly functional, highly effective, or maybe you're just getting started. Some groups lack sponsorship, funding, and support. I mean, there are all kinds of different answers here. So I'd love for you to either text or use your browser, and the instructions are in the chat to vote. So we'll take a moment to get your responses. Maybe it's not. If you all can put in chat, I see some people putting their responses in chat because I think the poll itself is not active for some reason. So you can put it in chat. That's fine. That works. I see someone said B. Some groups lack sponsorship, funding, and support. A lot of people said B. Someone said C, just getting started. D, we don't have any active ERGs, just getting started. All groups are fully sponsored, funded, and supported. I like it. That's a good case study, whoever said that. Someone said funding was much better during better market timing. Makes sense. Yeah, someone else said C, just getting started. Okay, perfect. So you can continue to enter your responses um, in chat, but I want to talk to you about what one ERG did. And this is actually, I'm super proud of them because they just launched their ERG. And so one of the things that we talked about initially, we talked about executive sponsorship and we talked about the importance of aligning with whatever is important to the company, right? Your executive sponsor will help you do that. But as an ERG, a lot of times you're fighting an uphill battle. A lot of times it's, well, we have all these competing priorities. Typically, it's mostly a volunteer organization, even if there are some benefits or perks, or even if you have your direct boss who's saying, hey, I want you to participate in this. And there are other non monetary benefits, but essentially, it's a volunteer role, right? And a lot of times, unfortunately, for employee resource groups, they are led by the people who are impacted by the inequities. So if there is an employee resource group that is looking to help change things for African American employees, they are led by those same Black employees. And so a lot of times it becomes stressful, right? And I hear a lot from ERG leaders that they want to do more, but they don't have the support, or they don't have the sponsorship, or they don't have the funding. So with this first group, one of the things that they did two things. One, they paid attention to what their CEO said at the beginning of the year in terms of what was the strategic priority. So that CEO said that gender balance was a high priority. Now, this particular ERG was not really focused on gender. They actually were for Black and Brown employees. Like, that is the focus of the ERG. However, what they decided to do to really launch their ERG inside of the organization is their very first event was in Women's History Month that just ended, and they focused on women. And they focused on the intersectionality of women and how women have barriers in the workplace and what women need to do internally, to really deal with that, but also what the organization needs to do to attract more women, to promote more women, to develop more women. So they sponsored it. They brought in a professional speaker, and they did it all virtually. And they also asked people if they wanted to be a part of their ERG as a part of their registration. So if you remember what I just shared with you about what we do with data, right? And how we can collect data on the front end. This ERG actually did that. So what they saw was that they started out with 45 members and they had an increase up to 114 members from one event. And they were really struggling, like, hey, we need support. Hey, we need more people to join. But all they did is that they hosted this event. It was tied to Women's History Month. It was tied to what the CEO said was important. And they asked a couple of questions on the front end. And one of those questions was enrolling people in their ERG. So I'm sharing that example just to say this is something that is not super difficult, but it was extremely impactful. And they still have a lot of challenges. They still have some things they need to do because they're just launching. But hopefully that plants a seed for you all as you think about how employee resource groups do have some barriers, but there are ways around it. And hopefully for you, there are some ways that you can think about, hey, how can I do this at work? What are some actual things that we can do for those of you who are involved in employee resource groups? And if you're not, I encourage you to actually support the employee resource groups that are at your company. They are always looking for volunteers. They're always looking for people who are committed to do some of maybe the more mundane things, but also to help with programming and to help with outreach and to increase membership and, to make sure that there's a development opportunity for the people who are members. So I encourage you to think about what you can do to support your ERGs and maybe take it a page out of the book of the example I just shared with you. All right, so I think we're going to jump into, let's see, what time is it? Yes, we have time. So let's jump into increasing belonging. Let's jump into this part. So a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, this idea around belonging feels very squishy. It feels like, well, what is that? And how do we measure that? And It's about how people feel. And yes, it is about how people feel. But I think what's important first is to talk about why belonging matters, to talk about why this is important. So the statistics that I'm showing right now come from a study on the value of belonging that was published by Better Up, but also republished and summarized in HBR. And so this talks about how there is a direct increase in productivity and job performance when employees feel like they belong. But here's the main thing, and if you notice, I kind of broke this out. If you had 10,000 people in your company, the annual gain for having your employees feel like they belong is $52 million for 10,000 people. Now, some of you work for companies that are much smaller than that. Some of you work for companies that are 5 times as big, right? But I want you to think about when you are talking to your leadership, when you are getting those executive sponsors on board, and when you're really making the case for why we need to do what we're doing for belonging, these are some of the numbers that you can use. So we're happy to share this report and study. You'll get an email with resources after the session with some follow-ups and some things that you can read on your own. But I found this to be really impressive because a lot of times belonging feels like something that you can't measure. And even if you can't measure the feeling, you can measure the outcome when your employees feel like they belong. So I'm going to share something with you. This is actually a project that we did, and we did get permission from the video subject. And so it's a project that we did at Chevron, and this is someone who has a powerful story to tell. And one of the things that we do in this approach is to figure out how we can amplify underrepresented voices. And so in this case, this is something back in February that our client wanted to do for Black History Month. So it was about amplifying those voices within that particular department. But also it was about for us, hey, this is a way for you to create something that not only amplifies this voice, but also increases the sense of belonging in the organization because people are now connected to this person that they haven't worked with. The other part was really interesting is that when we published this video, Candace, who's in the video, she shared an email with me, and all she said was that, Janae, when I watched my video, I wept. And we don't have the whole clip because it's about 4 minutes long, and I figure we don't have a whole lot of time. But I'll show you a part of what she said. But to summarize this, Candace tells a story about how when she first joined Chevron years ago, she actually lost her eyesight completely in one eye. And she talked about how she had to go through all these surgeries. She talked about how, she became very concerned about being able to even keep her job because of all the medical challenges. And she talked about how she felt supported at work, but she talked about how she wanted to share that as not just a Black story, but a human story. And so over on the right, you can see these are actually screenshots from where this was posted internally inside of the company and what her coworkers felt about her. I think the one that stood out to me the most was this part about, wow, Candace, in all the years I've known you, I had no idea. That was very powerful, and I'm so proud of you. So going back to that whole sense of belonging, for Candace, and not just for Candace, but for people who look like Candace in the organization, now she feels like, well, people see me, they know me, and I feel accepted because there's all of these accolades, there's all of these things that people are saying about Candace because they've seen her story. So this is not going to be for everyone, and not every company has the infrastructure or the time or the budget to create videos about all their employees. But I want you to think about what could you do at your company that is something like this? What is something that you could do, even if it's just about featuring someone in a newsletter, even if it's just about thinking about all the different months that celebrate different cultures. So we're in April now. April is actually Celebrate Diversity Month. And then June is Pride. We have November is Veterans Day. I mean, there are all these different opportunities that you can celebrate and amplify these voices, which forges a sense of belonging. The other cool thing about this is that now these videos that we created as a part of this project are actually being used to help with recruiting. And so all of these companies are saying, hey, we want to attract diverse talent. Well, diverse talent needs to see that there are people who actually look like them, who work at the company. And so I want you to think about all the multiple uses, all the different things that you could do with something like this. So I'm going to play just a clip, and I hope that the audio comes through.
I also,
Can you all hear the audio?
I'd like to say,
Okay.
influence to me is a Kandaki. So my name is Candace. The Candaces were queens of Ethiopia, and there was one called Amara. I call myself a warrior because she was a warrior that was able to save her land from the Romans, and she actually was
Turn it up.
blinded in one eye during battle. So that also makes me continue to fight. I want the rest of the world to know that there's love, there's light in
Can
me,
you turn it up?
and anyone walking in my shoes that looks like me. We bleed the same, we feel the we love the same, we hurt the same. Um, that we are warriors, like we are strong people.
So for those of you, I don't know if you were able to hear all of that, but what Candace was saying is she was talking about how she was named after a warrior. And she talked about relating back to her ancestors, relating back to her family. And so what was so interesting is that her coworkers started creating a hashtag after they saw her video. They started creating this hashtag, and I think in one of these it just said warrior, but some of the comments said like warrior queen Candace. One hashtag was no one should have a ceiling, because she talks about that. She said, I speak of no ceilings. No one should have a ceiling. Everyone should have the opportunity to do what it is that they were called to do, what they're intended to do, without barriers. So it was amazing to see how her coworkers got to know who she was on a very human level. And I want you to think about how this could be impactful in your organization, not so much if you do video, but even if it's just, here's a picture of someone, let's tell their story, right? Which takes very little effort. It's something you could work with your comms team on. You don't necessarily have to have an external company come in and help you. But I want you to think about how you could do this and how you could really be intentional about amplifying these voices and the impact that it has on the organization. All right, so we're going to move on. We're going to move on because I'm going back to whoever has their hand raised. And you all are quiet today on Bold X Brave, but that's okay, because I see there are a lot of new people. So I don't think they necessarily know how we roll on Bold X Brave. So in just a few minutes, I have a special guest. And he and I are going to have a really great conversation about equity. But before we get into that, I want to make sure that we go back and look at some of the things that we've talked about so far. So we talked about executive sponsorship. We talked about this dilemma around data and how to solve that. And really some potential solutions. We talked about what happens with ERGs and why some of them are struggling and what are some of the things that you can do. And then we just talked about increasing belonging. And so the reason why we want to talk about equity today, and the reason why I'm super excited to have someone who wrote a whole book about it, is because this is probably one of the most common questions I've heard. What is equity exactly? And how do we know when we've actually achieved it? How do we know that equity has actually been met in our organization? And a lot of times, I think early on for me, I took for granted the fact that people understood what equity was. I took for granted the fact that just because their CEO used this word in a statement, and a lot of CEOs did last year, they used the word, they used the terminology. So the idea was that, oh, well, everybody knows what that means. Everybody knows what it's going to look like when we get there. And what we found is that that couldn't have been further from the truth. And so, Lawrence, I see you have already come on camera. So I'm happy for us to go ahead and jump in. I want to formally introduce you, though, as we get into this section about what is equity and what can we do about inequity, and really talk about some of the things that you've written in your book. So I have my notes here, and I want to just point out a couple of things, but I know Lawrence personally. We actually met back at Howard University. I'm not going to say how many years ago, Lawrence, it was back at Howard University. And it's so amazing how, God will just bring people back around in your life and you don't really know why or why your paths cross again. But that's what happened with Lawrence and I. So we found out that we were both kind of in the same vein, in the same work. And I found his book And I was like, wait a minute. Everybody needs to know about this book. We're going to share the details of the book as well. There'll also be a link to purchase the book and how to get in contact with Lawrence. But just a couple of things about Lawrence. Lawrence has grown a reputation for getting to the heart of the matter by identifying specific behaviors that are directly impacting business outcomes. So his approach is very much based in behavior change and looking at what behaviors are happening in your company that are impacting those outcomes. Over the last 15 years, Lawrence has been able to hone these skills through his current consulting practice, 828 LLC, focusing on equity, leadership, and inclusion. And he's primarily in the Pacific Northwest, but he is expanding by the day. What was so interesting is that we shared about Lawrence being on this webinar on LinkedIn. And I mean, my notifications were blowing up, Lawrence. I was like, what? There were so many people like, yes, Lawrence is going to be there. I'm coming. So I am so excited to introduce to you all Lawrence Garrett. And Lawrence, if there's anything else that I missed that you want to add, please do share. And then we'll go ahead and dig into this whole equity conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Janae. And it's a pleasure and honor to be here. You brought up the Howard and HU connection. And so I think it's fitting to even kind of how does equity apply to even how I arrived at Howard, which I think will be a kind of an interesting story. So back in high school, that 11th grade year when SATs are running hard and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do, what are you going to do when you grow up, when you get in the real world. And I remember I'm a Los Angeles, California native. So all throughout my kind of academic high school career as a magnet student who pushed for AP classes and honor roll and things of that nature, all my counselors and all my kind of like guidance counselors and principals and teachers had me focusing on UC schools, right? Like those are the schools. And I remember just going through a number of different applications because, they cost money. And I remember talking to my Spanish teacher and I said, gosh, I just don't really know where to apply. I don't really know what to do. And he said, have you ever considered an HBCU? And I want to tell you, this is what I said. I said, yeah, that'd be a pretty cool idea. I watched the Cosbys, but I kind of want to go to a good school. Yes. I said, I kind of want to go to a good school. And what he said to me after I made that statement revolutionized my life. That was actually the starting place of when I began to take an equity journey. This is what he said to me. He said, good for whom? I never even thought about it from that perspective. He said, it's good for whom? And it was the first time that I had to kind of acknowledge that I'm buying into conditions that maybe didn't best serve me. And when he started laying out HBCU graduates graduate with starting pay higher, they go to graduate programs more likely, like all of the benefits that would actually work in my favor if I decided to go to an HBCU. So only to say that I went on an HBCU shortly after that. There was 21 of us that went on this HBCU tour. Unfortunately, I would say there was like no one actually who had an HBCU as their number one choice. But at the end of this trip, out of 21 of us, 17 ended up going to an HBCU.
Wow.
And it was because of the conditioning that it was like the scales fell. And we're like, wait a minute, this is actually the better option for me because they're working in my best interest.
Wow. So Lawrence, I mean, you and I had this conversation before about similar, I was in Southern California, I went to high school in San Diego, having like a very different perspective on HBCUs, but how, we are conditioned to think that some of our own institutions as Black people are less than, right?
Correct.
But think about if we're conditioned to think that way, then how much more, or maybe the rest of the world saw it that way as well. And so what I want to get into, your book, okay, so I always rant about the book. Yeah. And I talk about how the Equity Starter Kit was originally written for a blueprint for high schools and high school leaders. But when I read the book and when I saw some of the models in the book, I hit up Lawrence like, hey, we need to talk. because so many corporations and so many of our clients that we work with, they do not understand what equity is. They also don't understand how to get there. And you approach it from a behavior change perspective and a culture change perspective with an emphasis on leadership.
Yeah.
So I love this quote at the top: disparities exist where equity doesn't. Can you just, if someone asks you like, hey, Lawrence, what's equity and what does that look like in my company? Like, how do you answer that question?
I love it. And I'm glad we're starting with language, because language is actually really the starting place. This is the reason why I started to work in K through 12 education, because we don't have the vernacular. We don't have a common understanding of what terms mean, right? Like, for example, I mean, just something basic. Organizations and companies are struggling with the idea of what racism means, right? Because we don't have an academic understanding of what it means. So when someone refers to it as being a racist act at work, you know, you've got three different interpretations of what actually happened and what it means, because there isn't a clear understanding, right? So the first thing we got to do is establish a glossary of terms, because if we understand it the same way, we can see it the same way, right? So let's talk about equity. Equity is an evaluation. It's a measurement. It's a calculation of value, fairness, justice, judgment. So it's a way of how we associate. Let's use the word value, for example. You remember I used the word good? Remember I said a good school, right? So in the concept of equity, how did I measure what was considered good? Or better yet, when the listeners or the viewers to this, how do we even consider what is a good neighborhood? Good for who? Mm-hmm. What's a good school? Good for who? What's a good restaurant? Good for who? When we're talking about safety, right? Public safety, who's safe, right? So when we get clear on language and terms and who are we referencing, that's the first thing, right? The value assessment of the terms that we're using. The second one, when I mentioned in regards to fairness, and I imagine if we're talking to some corporate folks, I imagine there's some Rotarians in the room here, right? That's the 4-way test, right? So is it fair? Like, who are we looking at when we're defining these terms, and who does it disproportionately impact? So then the next thing is justice. See, the reason why equity is really a tough subject to address is because inherently equity is addressing structure. It's addressing historical structure and how the scales have never been fair. So it's a hard thing to look at, right? But it's something that needs to be adjusted if we're talking about things on an institutional level. And then the last thing is judgment, right? So it's the awareness of how do we deploy, right? And in this framework, how do we center our people? How do we adjust our practices? How do we institute policy? And how do we promote it in a healthy where it's congruent to the stuff that we're saying that we're about?
I hope you all are taking notes, because Lawrence is dropping nuggets and gems right now, and actually giving you the blueprint. Like, it's giving you the steps to even help your organization come to an understanding. So Lawrence, I want you to talk a little bit about, for those, because there are people on the call right now who are immersed in this work, right? Like they are forging a path inside of their organization. I see a few people who maybe are external consultants, but a lot of them are trying to lead the charge inside of their organization. So I know there are a few people who are leading like a DEI committee or a task force, for example. Maybe they've been, collecting data and doing studies and doing listening sessions and trying to come up with a strategy. So, you have these different pieces, and even if I'm looking at what's on your slide, and you're kind of giving them sort of, here are the steps, here are the things that you need to do to empower and implement equity. But what would you say to those people who are leading it right now and are running into some of the barriers that we talked about? Lack of executive sponsorship. Yeah. Maybe they're leading an ERG and they can't get funding for that ERG, or they don't have enough volunteers, or they don't have enough visibility in the organization. Maybe they're struggling to collect data because IT says, well, you can't send out another survey right now because we already did a survey, so we're not doing it anymore. Like, these are some of the things that really are happening. And how do you talk to those people who are saying, you know what, I'm frustrated and I'm tired?
Right. I think the first thing is we have to get clear on why is there such resistance, right? What is causing the resistance? more times that I have found is that people who sit in those positions don't have a clear understanding of what is trying to get accomplished. They tend to fall back to think this is a political agenda, right? Which we can even, I mean, I would love to come back and just talk about that in itself. But there's this kind of component to not recognizing this is a humanitarian issue, right? Not a political one. So when we can frame it, and then here's the other thing, philosophically, right? How I see equity being approached, it's really two different ways. It's we're going to enforce it and we're going to make people embrace it, or there's the skill of how do we get people to embrace it so they will enforce it. And that's really where the skill comes in, is how do we get people to understand how to embrace this so they will enforce it? Because the goal really is, and you probably have all heard this quote before, but we can't tear down the master's house with the same tools that built it, right? Like we've got to think about this completely different in our approach and our style. We're not going to use bully tactics. We're not going to use tools that obviously have created the inequities that currently exist. So we've got to reframe how we're even approaching doing it. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing that I found really interesting is that anti-racism work, anti-Blackness work, equity work is such a heavy kind of toll on organizations from the very beginning, right? Because there's no clear understanding of what words mean or terms mean. There's no clear understanding of the objective of what happens, right? So oftentimes the approach that I've seen most effective is let's just talk about being culturally responsive. Now, I'm not talking about cultural competence. I'm talking about cultural responsiveness. And that means the agility and ability to shift perspective and adapt behavior according to commonality and difference that's in a room. There's almost a lack of situational awareness, of being even aware of what is in the room and how it's impacting people, right? So we can help organizations recognize, like, stop blundering around just saying words and doing things that are harming people, right? And choosing to be intentional, choosing to intentionally be unintentional about understanding this stuff.
Wow.
This is what's causing the harm. It's the complicity, right? But if you recognize, like you had talked about earlier, how much belonging actually increases production, and if you can get your managers and leaders to recognize, how do I create spaces so that can happen, this actually helps everyone. And I'm pretty sure, Janae, you've got the numbers and the research to show it's actually proven across the board when there's more Black women involved in the organization, everyone actually does well.
Facts. And that is, it's true though. And I think, the excuse about, well, we don't know if this is actually effective, we're not sure what the impacts are, or is this really something that we need to do, have to do? The research is out there, right? So it's not just because I have access to some, unpublished white paper or something like that. That's not the case. The research exists to actually support this. But I think it's what you said, like you said being intentionally unintentional about what to do about equity. So if you stay in a state of confusion, or as a leader, if I'm always in a state of confusion, well, we're not sure, I don't know what we're gonna do, and we're still thinking about this, well, we have these competing priorities, well, we're distracted by this. Like, this is a list of reasons that you kind of stay in that space. And I think for some, just based on some of our poll questions early on in this session, Lawrence, there are a lot of people who work for companies that are dealing with those kind of attitudes and behaviors and mindsets. So my question to you then is how do you address the mindset that is behind the behavior?
Yeah, so I think, oh gosh, there's so much to say about that, Janae. But what's important is when I go back to that framework of equity in its pillars is people, practice, policy, and promotion. First of all, who are we centering our attention on? What I found far too often for those who are intentionally being unintentional, what's really going on is that there's a fear that there is going to be some uncomfort, right? that is within an organization. So it's about protecting the uncomfortable, right? And what I found, if I'm going to put language and specific words to it, what happens is that there's a tendency to put energy on white comfort at the expense of Black pain. And so people will find themselves finding ways to be silent, to be disengaging, to find ways to disregard, to try to kind of throw in more just governance, like all of these different things, when the root of the issue is that there's a level of protection that is going on that we're not being honest about.
Yeah. Yeah. And not telling the truth about it. You're so right. So I want to switch gears a little bit, Lawrence, because I want to talk about some of the common challenges that we hear about in organizations, particularly in corporate. So, there's a lot of talk about microaggressions, right? And how this exists in organizations, and also the gaslighting that comes along with it. So I have, had the experience where clearly someone is communicating with me in a way that is offensive, aggressive, but it's under the guise of like, oh, I'm just joking. Yeah. Or, oh, no, I didn't mean anything like that. You're being extra sensitive. You know what I mean? So there's sort of like, if I'm offended, then you're now telling me that my offense doesn't qualify up to your standard of how I should be offended. So this doesn't qualify as an actual offense. And that's where the gaslighting comes in. So these are real challenges. And a lot of times on a corporate side, this topic of microaggressions, it keeps coming up over and over and over again. And leaders are saying, well, we don't even know how to define that. And we definitely don't know what to do about it. And what we know is that if your workplace actually is on a progressive equity journey, that gets resolved, right? Because that is a culture issue. But right. What about the workplaces that are not on that progressive journey? Like, what do you say? What kind of tips or information, or how do you even give people encouragement or hope that something can be done about it?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the IDI, which is the Intercultural Development Inventory Assessment. What it does, it measures someone's, again, capability to shift perspective and adapt behavior according to cultural commonality and difference, and it's quantifiable. See, what I love about that, especially in corporate spaces, it's a metric, individualized for you, right? That's one. The second thing that it does, it actually gives people a perceived orientation of where they think they are, and then a developmental orientation of where they actually are. And 99% of the time, people are always going to overestimate what they actually think they're doing in regards to inclusion and acceptance, right? And so I just say, welcome to being American, baby. That's what we do. We overcompensate, right? So one of the things that's really helpful, though, is getting, again, I know we want to get to a structural level, but oftentimes it's getting people to individually take responsibility and accountability to their own behavior in a measurable form, right? So once someone has this recognition, like, oh, I thought I was this way, but I see, according to this report, I'm really this way, then the question is, what are you going to do about it? Right. Wow. And then who is going to be responsible and accountable to making sure that things are changing? What I also love about the tool and report, it gives you an organizational report. So it's giving you like an aggregate of everyone's results and says, organizationally, you're here. And I'll tell you what the here is. There's 5 different domains. You're either in denial, which a lot of people are. You're in polarization. So polarization is an either or, it's never an and thinking. There's a minimization. So you tend to see difference, but you want to draw back to kind of like universal terms, and it masks deeper issues that are addressing. It's like saying all lives matter. Well, of course it does, but what are you masking, right? So, and then the next thing is acceptance, right? So this is a kind of a deeper understanding of what's going on in difference and how do I match it? And then there's adaptation. And so when an organization can see that I'm in denial, what's a classic example of someone at the denial culture organization? The people who say, I don't see color, right? That's flat out denial, right? Matter of fact, I don't know if you've heard this acronym before, Janae, but denial is an acronym for don't even know I am lying, right? Like you're not even aware that what you're saying is a lie. Like you're lying to yourself. You're delusional, right? So right? So there's a component of like, How do we help people just move out of denial, right?
Right.
So then the second piece, which is interesting in polarization, and this is really where a lot of corporate organizations find themselves. They're stuck in an either or paradigm, right? And so what polarization does, it sees things as is us versus them. It's either this way or that way. It's hierarchical. And bring me back on, and we could talk about the pains of patriarchy and how that plays out, right? And so how we start seeing, yep. So sexism and racism are running on the same conveyor belt, right? So we can get to that, right? But when we start recognizing that the danger in polarization is it has a tendency to conflate two mutually exclusive ideas, right? And don't get me wrong, progressives do it just like conservatives do it. And so I'll give you an example of what I mean. And this is the danger, and this is what we have to address with our higher up leaders is this, are you conflating ideas, right? So, and what I mean by that is someone would hear, oh, Black Lives Matter, and they're thinking, oh, you're anti-cop. No, those are two exclusive ideas that you just conflated, and you don't even realize you conflated. So if we want to get to the psychology of it, we're talking about schemas, like these mental models, these packages that people just adopt, and they don't even realize that you're associating things that need to be looked at in its nuance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And again, this is why it goes back to language, right? When you don't understand terms and language, here's another one, privilege. People hear privilege and they start freaking out, right? Because they don't have an idea. The tendency is they think privilege means, oh, I grew up and I had all this stuff and I made it and I had it easy. No, privilege doesn't mean you had it easy. What it means is there's stuff you never even have to think about.
Yes.
Right? That is the privilege. Here's the key thing. As a guy, right? As a guy, I have male privilege. There's things as a guy I don't have to think about in regards to my safety that women have to think about all the time. Yep. And so my key thing in trainings and supports with organizations, I'm like, okay, if I'm Black and I can acknowledge that I have privilege as a guy, what's so hard about acknowledging as being white that you have a privilege? Come on, like, let it go.
Listen, we could do a whole segment on that, but I think this is something that I've shared openly often, but particularly between last year and this year, where we've seen some of the like blatant stark contrast between how certain people are treated versus how others are treated, right? And what it boils down to is that privilege is about immunity, period. So what you said is that, hey, as a man, there are certain things that I am immune to, that will never be a part of my reality. I will never have to even question what's happening because I'm a man. And so I love that you shared that. I love that you shared that as a Black man.
And heterosexual.
Go ahead.
I was going to say heterosexual too. Like that's another piece of that too.
Yes, as a heterosexual man, you already automatically have immunity just based on who you are, regardless of how you grew up, whether you were wealthy or in abject poverty, there is still privilege. Yep. See, Lawrence, we weren't even going to talk about privilege today. That wasn't even on the agenda, but I mean, it's relevant to everything that we're talking about, right? Because a lot of times, our goal is to look at how do we remove some of these barriers so that the people who are showing up here who are saying, hey, I really want to be a part of the solution, but here's the challenge I'm having, and I'm trying to take action, but our organization is slow to move, and our leaders are distracted, and our executives are not committed, and. Right. But privilege is at the underpinning of all of that, right? Like it's at the root of it. So I want to ask you one more thing, and then also people are in chat just like echoing some of the things that you're saying, Lauren. So we'll be sure to get that transcript to you so you can see what the responses are. But if you have a specific question for Lawrence, please make sure you put that in chat or in the Q&A so that we can address that while he's on. So I want to ask you about this whole idea around sustaining change, around sustainability. And so it's in your model. So it's number 8 is to sustain the change. So let's say you've done all the other steps, but in the implementation, the sustainability part is key. So earlier in this session, we talked about how being data-driven in your approach allows for transparency and also helps to drive sustainability, because it's more than just about one leader saying one thing and making some commitments and removing some barriers, because then when that leader is gone, your organization reverts back to what it was.
Right.
So what would you share with us about that sustainability piece? And hey, if you find areas where you really are forging through and seeing some change, how do you sustain that?
Yeah, I think it's the topic of discussion, Janae, that you had mentioned earlier. It's KPIs. It's key performance indicators. Like, we need to have measurables that are being audited and monitored and measured on a monthly, quarterly basis, not at the end of the year. Let's bring some people in a room and let's feel good about some event we did, right? Which is usually what the case is, right? So the more it is embedded in the actual measurement, just like quarterly reports, just like any other measurement that you're using in an organization, these are the things that need to be identified. And so the work is, what are those? And so one of my recommendations has always been 3 to 5. You only need 3 to 5 to, I don't want to say only, I would say just focusing on 3 to 5 KPIs that really target the concerns and the issues and the pain points of the organization. It allows people to rally around it. You know what I mean? It's not overbearing. It's not too much to follow. And it's something that everyone can start talking about as success is happening within the organization.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think, you know, this whole notion of designing KPIs around equity and inclusion, it feels like when I talk to people about it, it feels brand new to them. It's like, well, but we have KPIs for everything else, right? We measure everything else in corporate spaces, everything.
Yeah.
So this is really about not creating some new infrastructure to do it, but tapping into the infrastructure that you already have from a technology and from a process standpoint.
Right.
And just helping people to see that, yes, this can be done, and this is why it's important. So, you know, I think the last thing, let's see. Oh, I see Stacy saying any type of change requires evolution along the journey and continuous improvement as you move. So meaning that we have these 8 steps here, right? But I'm sure at points in time in that equity journey, you'll have to revisit some of these, right?
Yeah.
So when the power dynamics change, even if you're on step 6, you might have to go back and revisit that.
Absolutely. Janae, is it possible to show on the slide on the perspective of results? Because when you start talking about, and I can pull it up if you can give me access.
Yeah, I'll give you permission to share.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
let me see if I can do it too, because I think this will be helpful as well. Let's see. Okay. Yeah,
I stopped sharing, so have at it. And we have a few more minutes, so please.
All right, it's still saying that host is not allowing.
Let's see. We may have to make you a co-host. Okay, try it now, Lawrence.
All right, let's see here. Can people see this?
It's coming up.
Okay, let me. All right, my screen is freezing. All right, give me a second. There we go.
Yeah, okay. It's coming up. All right, perfect. We can see it.
So I just wanted to share this, and Janae hit me up and said, Lawrence, it's this right here, right? So, so I just, this is in the opening introduction of my book, and I talk about, you know, we have to help people understand how results happens, right? Because when we can get people, right, when we're talking about bringing people along, we want to call people in before we call them out, all that stuff, right? The challenge that we have societally is that people think results happens in individual formats, right? It's this idea of resilience and vision and hard work and things of that nature. And that's true. So when someone says that to me, Janae, I don't say, oh, it's not just about that. I say, it's not that you're incorrect, you're incomplete. You're not seeing everything else. And so that's some of the language we need to start using with folks when they just focus on, well, I just see things as an individual and I treat people as an individual and things of that nature, right? Because that's a construction of whiteness, right? It's to only be able to see things in an individualized way, right? So when we get people to understand the socialization factors, right? So that's when you start talking about microaggressions. You start talking about belonging. You start talking about internalized oppression. Yeah, bring me back on that one, because that's another thing we need to talk about, right? And so when we start recognizing there's some socialized factors, right, that play a role in the impact. And then there's the structure, the systems, the things that were designed, right, to have. And some people's like, well, I don't know if I really believe in all this stuff. I love using examples because I say, okay, well, you're a sports person, right? So you also recognize that certain players look great on some teams because of the structure and the design and the philosophy of that team, and yet they go to another team and they suck. How does that happen when it's the same player? Oh, well, I'm not a sports person. I don't really understand. Okay, great. Let's use your daughter that you decided to take into a private school. If it's always about individualized results, why didn't you just send them to the public school down the street? She's smart, right? Oh, you wanted to put her in the right environment. Oh, it sounds like structure, right? So that she has the right environment so she can succeed. So all of a sudden you can recognize it when it has something to do outside of what we're talking about here, which is historically marginalized communities. Somehow it's still about individuals, but yet everything else in society, we understand it in an ecological way.
Wow. Fred is saying, manage the environment to guide the behavior. So we talk about individual behaviors, but also the onus is on leadership to determine what that environment is going to be, right? One of the things that one of our past guests said, that culture is actually the real CEO. That's the real CEO. Culture actually runs the company. It's not actually the CEO. It's not the executive leadership team. Culture is the real CEO.
Yeah.
And so if you look at your culture, that determines how your company is being led and how it's moving forward.
Absolutely.
Maria said, yes, and mindset. It means, yes, you are correct, and there is more to it. There's some other comments that are coming up in chat that I don't want to miss. And I'm looking back, Lawrence, because there are a lot of people who are just co-signing what you're saying, but I want you to just share with us, how do we get the book? Because I've just been like, y'all, just get the book. I mean, I send the link to people, hey, you need to just get the book. You need to read the book, because in the book, what I love about it is that not only is it a relatively quick read, but a lot of these models that you're showing and talking about today are actually in the book.
It is.
So yeah, you got to get the book. So Exo put the link to order the book in chat already. But that link will be in there again. Lawrence just put the link to his website. But tell us, how can people get in contact with you? I know you have the website link there, but also, how do they order the book?
Yeah, so I will send a follow-up link with my publisher that you can get it directly from my website. I would say follow me if you're on Facebook. I actually run a media group called the A28 group, and we just give out free content all the time in regards to the equity journey. So this can be something you put in your wheelhouse as well. Also, what I would say is, look for me on LinkedIn. All the other kind of tools that are out there. I do want to share, if it's okay, Janae, a little bit how I stumbled into this, right? How I stumbled to becoming a practitioner. And it's actually the opening of my book, where I talk about being an executive director for a leadership organization. And I found myself going to all these fundraiser events. I think you all are familiar with them, right? A fundraiser event for the at-risk youth, right? And I found myself growing cynical. And I couldn't figure out, why am I becoming more and more cynical? These kind of white-led organizations who mean well, they've got kind of good programs and they're helping people out, and you hear the story that makes you cry, and everyone gets their pocketbooks out, right? And they write the checks. And I'm like, what is going on with, why am I being cynical about this? And after kind of a discussion, I went home that night and I'm just like wrestling with, like, what is going on? Why am I being this way? And then I'm driving on the freeway one day, Janae, and I see this billboard, and it was a billboard of a casino, and it talks about like all these winners, like you could be a winner too. And then I look to the left and I see all these cars in a parking lot, and I was like, that's it. Institutionalized racism works like a casino. It promotes what's possible, but it profits on what's probable. So it sells people all this idea of what's possible, right? This is why you hear the Oprah Winfrey's and the Ben Carsons. They sell people jail to Yale stories. Mm-hmm. And so what I want to leave you with, if you really want to be a practitioner of equity, right, we need to start examining what is probable here. What is the probable outcome for those who are marginally or historically marginalized? What is the probable experience for them? What is the probable outcome for them? And why is that the case, right? Because when you start studying the blackjack table, right, and you start studying the roulette, you start seeing, oh, okay, so in casinos, the house wins, right?
Always.
That's why they're in business.
Always. Yep. Lawrence, I just want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge. I encourage everyone to go get the book. I encourage you to get it for people who you are connected to. This is a great group read for employee resource group boards who are all kind of working on, okay, what do we need to do next and how do we move and how do we influence change? But it's also a great read for parents, right? To understand the educational system and what their role should be in forging equity in the K through 12 system, because we know that that's where that starts, right? So Lawrence, I just want to thank you again. And everyone, the link to his book and also link to his website is in chat. So please make sure you check that out. I am going to go ahead and wrap up.
Janae, hold on, sorry, I apologize. There is one question that came in the Q&A. So, and I think it's specifically for Lawrence. How do you challenge leadership when they try to protect those who are uncomfortable with this work? Referencing your point about protecting white comfort at the expense of Black pain.
So if I hear the question, how do you challenge leadership when you can tell there's some complicity in protecting comfort and creating barriers and more resistance of the work, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's.
Yeah, so I think, obviously every case is individualized, right? But what I would say is really kind of unpacking what is their fear, right? Because really what leaders in this position that find themselves resistant to is that they haven't unpacked their fear. What are you afraid of? What is the fear here, right? And maybe they won't share it, maybe they will, maybe you need somebody else, right? That can help ask those questions. But again, when we're talking about culture, we're talking about behavior. When we're talking about behavior, right, we've got to get to these kind of main drivers of what drives decision making. And the truth is, a lot of it in its work is fear-based.
Wow. I hope whoever asked that question, I hope that helps to address it. Thank you for that, Lawrence. And there are a lot of people that are just showing their gratitude in chat. Just thank you for the session. I know that we are almost out of time, but there's a lot of gratitude. One, primarily coming from me and from our entire team at CTM Unlimited. We appreciate you at coming in and adding just, the level of value that people got today it's masterclass level. So I appreciate you just lending that. And I hope everyone will go out and buy Lawrence's book, because it is so relevant and so timely. No matter what type of industry you work in, it is for you. So finally, I want to leave you all with this. What are the steps that you can take now? You heard a lot, okay? Our whole idea, our whole focus here today was about action. And so there are some things that you can do. We talked about data a lot. Look at your data and prioritize and find creative and efficient ways to collect the data you need to make decisions, so that we're no longer having these excuses of we don't really know what to do. Well, you have a way to find out, right? So you have that action to take. And then secondly, start amplifying those underrepresented voices in your organization. And I always promote this because a lot of times while your senior leadership may be working on this holistic 18-month strategic plan, this is something that you can do right now to show commitment. This is something that you can do right now to start fostering that sense of belonging. So yes, a lot of DEI initiatives are starting from top down, but you can also create this groundswell and this bottom-up movement by just really being connected with the people who are underrepresented voices in your organization. And then finally, identify gaps and get help. Come to our Bold X Brave Masterclass. That's happening. We do it quarterly. So there's some people I saw in chat who actually came to the one we did in January. And we'll share how you can get involved in that. We'll send out an email about it. And then tap into other internal and external resources. So Lawrence has a consultancy. If there are things that you specifically need help with, you know where to go get help. Like, we're not going to use that as an excuse anymore for not taking action. And so this is about the Bold X Brave Masterclass. You will get a link so you'll know more about it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there because I do want to ask you one last question before we leave. But one of the things to note about our masterclass this quarter is that we actually are offering it at 2 times because we got a lot of interest from people outside of the US who said, hey, I want to come, but it's the middle of the night. So this time around, we're doing it at 5 p.m. Central and also at 11 a.m. the next day. And you'll have an opportunity to register for both. And so the link will be in chat for that. And so for those of you who join, we do have a coupon code where it's only $97. And it's a 2-hour intensive where we actually work with you on your problems and your challenges in the organization. And we try to keep the classes small. So we try to top out at about 15 people so that everyone can get an opportunity to work through their challenges. So watch your email on Tuesday. Actually, you'll get some more information on this, but I just wanted to share that. So finally, based on everything we discussed today, and I always ask this at the end of Bold X Brave, and I want to see people participate in this part because I want to see your commitment. So there are a lot of things. Lawrence shared so many things that you all can start doing right now. We talked about data. We talked about your ERGs. We talked about increasing the sense of belonging. What is the one thing, the one action you can take in the next 30 days? Just the next 30 days. I'm not asking you to commit long-term, but what can you do in the next 30 days? And I see some people responding in chat. The instructions to the poll, if you have, I think you've already joined at this point. Unpack the fear. Woo, they got that from you, Lawrence. Read Lawrence's book. Yes. That if you can't do anything else, you can read the book. Do IDI assessments. That was a gem. Yes. Read the book. Lawrence, they're coming back and saying, look, just read the book. Next 30 days. Stakeholder assessment. Understand where the residual is coming from and why, or resistance is coming from. Ordering the book. Read Lawrence's book. People are saying, look, if you can't do anything else, read the book. Collect data during DEI trainings. I love it. Dive into the pool of equity, engage with facts and data with folks who may have different perspectives than me. Add KPIs, relook at our data, use the data. So the 2 big things are data and read the book. Like, if I had to summarize, learn more about DEI and data. I love it. Add questions to the registration forms. Yes, simple. Stakeholder assessment, understand where the resistance is coming from and why. Incorporate simple ways to gather data. So you all have made these commitments today. And obviously, no one's checking your work here. But I want to just leave you with this, like your courage to show up today and to stay on, because most of you are still here with us, even on a Friday afternoon, even on Good Friday, where a lot of you are off from work and some of you are on vacation and some are dialing in and connecting from their phones. I appreciate you. And I thank you on behalf of my entire team. I thank you for being here. I want to thank the CTM Unlimited team. I want to specifically thank Excel for managing the chat. And Lawrence, I want to thank you for just being a light. And in the midst of all of this and giving people hope, and not just hope, but actual tools of what they can do to really forge equity in their organizations. So until next time, be bold and be brave, everyone.
Thank you, Janae. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.